you very much for the nice introduction and the invitation. Okay, after Nico already told us the whole truth about perception, I'm glad that I can switch the topic to emotions. And there are quite a few recent approaches on embodied emotions that make the claim that we do not need representations to explain emotions as a phenomenon. And what I'm going to do in the talk is I'm going to sketch these anti-representationalist views with regard to emotions. I will focus on Giovanna Colombetti's recent book and on Dan Hatto's work and show their problems and thereby argue for a systematic need for representations in emotion theory. And in the end, I'll sketch an alternative account that views emotions as embodied action-oriented representations. So, but before I'm going to start with that, I'm going to have a quick look at the recent history of the philosophy of emotions. Cognitivist approaches to emotions became famous from the 60s on and kind of renewed the philosophical interest in emotions by arguing that emotions are not simply irrational or irrational phenomena, and by particularly pointing out that emotions are intentional, that they are meaningful states. And they argued, several authors, they argued that emotions are subject to semantic norms, also to rational norms in a broader sense, and to social norms, or you could also, some authors would even say moral norms or values. A conclusion that many authors draw from that is that they say emotions are judgments. We should think of emotions as judgments or other types of states with propositional content, but judgments is like a very famous view defended by Solomon, for example, or Martha Nussbaum. And this is like one famous claim. Another claim that rather was brought about by the psychological tradition is that emotions are about core relational themes. And this is very important because this is something that the whole, that these embodied accounts on emotions adopt from the cognitivist tradition. So Richard Lazarus made the claim that emotions are about core relational themes, which means that each particular emotion type, such as fear or anger or guilt, have a particular intentional object they are about. And then the question is, what are these objects? And Lazarus comes up with a whole taxonomy saying, well, fear is about something being dangerous, anger is about something being an offense, guilt is about something being a violation of a social rule or norm, and so on and so forth. So for each emotion type, you have this particular core relational theme the emotion appears to be about. And this in itself is something that many authors adopted from Lazarus, and particularly the authors I'm going to talk about, Jesse Prince, Giovanna Colombetti, Dan Hatto, all stick to this particular claim. So cognitivists assume that core relational themes are represented by judgments inferred from other judgments, and this then of course is the part that an author such as Jesse Prince would not adopt and would say, no, there are more, like we have other ways to explain how emotions can be about these core relational themes. But Richard Lazarus would say there's a complex chain of judgments about me being in a situation that is important for me, bad for me, where another person is kind of doing something with regard to me, and from all these judgments I infer that this was an offense. So that's like the approach in the background. And what Lazarus also has in mind is that we need this system of different types of judgments to individuate emotions and different emotion types. So to find out what the difference between a state of anger and a state of fear is, we have to look at these different change of judgments and say, aha, this is a state where somebody infers that something is dangerous for her, so that's a state of fear. And this is, of course, directed against, for example, traditional Jamesian approaches and the idea that you could differentiate different emotion types by looking at the bodily arousal, for example, alone, or at the action tendency alone. So the idea here is, no, you have to look at these core relational themes to find out what emotion that is that you have, that is there. So ever since the 90s, at least, there have been many, many objections against these cognitivist approaches. Here are just some standard objections that you find in the literature. what people, like the main worry is that cognitivism is over-intellectualizing the phenomenon, such that you would say, well, somehow it sounds uncomfortable that an emotion such as being afraid of a spider should be a judgment. One typical reason for that is to say, look, emotional episodes are very often cognitively impenetrable, in the sense that, well, if somebody tells you that the situation in front of you really is not dangerous and you full-heartedly believe that, that doesn't make the fear go away. In some cases it does, in others no. And that seems something where emotions, to simply like say they are judgments, somehow sounds uncomfortable to many people. Another point, of course, is that emotions occur in infants and animals, and there's plenty of studies from developmental psychology. Of course, there's ongoing debates, for example, of whether you should ascribe emotions such as guilt and shame to infants that are not able to understand conceptually, for example, that they violated a social rule. But with regard to emotions such as fear or joy or anger, there's hardly any debate of whether they can occur in infants before they have any understanding of any concepts. So here's many authors who brought forward these objections, and all these authors are defending different, you could say, non-cognitivist approaches to emotions that are very different in themselves. So Sabine Döring would argue that emotions are somehow perception-like. Jesse Prince would say, no, they are perceptions in quite a literal sense. Diana and Tironi would say emotions are a certain kind of attitude, and so on and so forth. And in the following, I'm going to focus on embodied accounts to emotion, which largely fall into this non-cognitivist camp. So here's Jesse Prince's account. This was one of the first popular monographs that developed an embodied approach to emotions. What Jesse Prince does is he defends this Jamesian idea that we find distinct patterns for different emotion types. Prince would say, well, at least for some, for the basic emotions, we find this bodily pattern. And then he kind of puts this idea into a Dretskian framework and says, well, and these bodily patterns do have a sort of meaning because they happen to co-occur with correlational themes that our ancestors already encountered in our environments. So emotions are set up to respond to these correlational themes, which I will come back to that later on, but this implies kind of a shift from calling correlational themes the contents of judgments to calling them relational properties in the environment. Now, this is just a very large, broad sketch. Now, Den Hatto, you're probably all familiar with the account that Eric Muhren and Den Hatto developed this radical and activist approach with a general claim in the background that there are basic states of the mind, such as perceptions and sensations, that we can explain in a non-representational way. And Hatto, in a recent paper, Truly Enactive Emotions, applied this view to emotions, and he says, there's surely no need to assume that emotional appraisals are essentially representational and hence solely heady affairs. So I'll develop his claims in a bit more detail in a minute. Just to give you an overview, here's another approach that came out very recently. Giovanna Combetti is more from the autopoetic enactivist tradition, and she has this idea that emotions are best conceptualized as dynamical patterns, namely as self-organizing configurations of the organism that have been shaped over evolutionary and developmental time. So this is the idea that she has in the background. Now, with regard to all these accounts, I think what they are particularly good at is they avoid the over-intellectualization of emotions that cognitivists have always been claimed to be guilty of. And they also can explain the action-orientedness and the intentionality of emotions by grounding them in bodily responses, which in a natural framework might be a particularly good thing. And also they can explain the complex entanglement of nature and nurture that you find in emotions. And this is actually quite a complex entanglement. And personally, I think that cognitivist accounts are terrible at characterizing this entanglement of what are biological and what are socially constructed phenomena that you find in emotions. And Giovanna Colombetti's account, for example, I think does very well with regard to that point. Now, the problem I want to focus on today is the question of anti-representationalism, and as most of you do know much better than I do, anti-representationalism is quite a central issue in the debate on embodied cognition. So embodied and situated approaches to cognition tend to avoid assumptions of complex inner representations, and instead they highlight the complex interaction of skillful embodied organisms and the environment, which I think is a good thing. But then the question is radical anti-representation really plausible with regard to emotions? So that's the question I'm going to focus on in the following. And if you look at the particular, what the authors particularly say about representationalism with regard to emotions, here is the quote from Giovanna Colombetti again: emotions are best conceptualized as dynamical patterns, namely as self-organizing configurations of the organism that have been shaped over evolutionary and developmental time. Yeah, with regard to that quote, it's not clear at all whether these patterns should be seen as representational in any form. Then if you look further, here's a part where Giovanna says, from an enactive perspective, danger, loss, and other core relational themes are not represented or detected, but enacted, namely brought forth in the world organism encounter. In other words, they are response dependent. So one thing that is eye-catching is that Giovanna adopts this view of emotions as being about core relational themes. That comes from the cognitivist tradition. It says, well, fear is about danger, sadness is about loss, and so on and so forth. But then she says, well, but we shouldn't think about this as representations or as something being represented or detected, but rather enacted, whatever that then means in detail. But another interesting thing then is that she says these organism world encounters are response dependent, which in the context of this quote is a response to Jesse Prince, who would say emotions are about relational properties that objectively exist in relation to the organism, which Colombetti would deny. But still, is this anti-representationalism or not? I'm not too sure. Here's another quote where Giovanna says, Enactivism is often associated with radical anti-representationalism, but this point needs to be qualified. Enactivism does not deny that the nervous system, for example, exhibits patterns of activity that occur reliably in a certain context, and even that these patterns can be seen as embodying meaning for this organism. Okay, I mean, it's fine to say that there are patterns that reliably occur in a certain context, but I mean, this alone does not give you any sense of a representation being there. So I think Giovanna, on the one hand, here says that she does not want to be called an anti-representationalist. And then on the other hand, she says, well, because there are these reoccurring patterns, which I think is a bit like, yeah, well, but reoccurring patterns are not representations. So I think the question is somehow still open. And I mean, this is a footnote in a whole book. So this is a footnote where she says, well, don't think of me as an anti-representationalist. But then what is eye-catching is that in the whole book, she does not really talk about the systematic questions or worries that you could have with regard to an anti-representationalist view. So I think there are certain open questions, namely, well, are there any semantic norms involved here? Of course, if you talk of patterns that reoccur in certain environments, are emotions intentional? This is something that in the cognitivist tradition, people like pointed out again and again, that they said, well, emotions are like given to us in a certain mode of representation, like the object of fear is given to us in a very particular way, and you should not like underestimate that. And this is like one reason why you should never think of Jamesian or behaviorist approaches as being somehow appropriate for characterizing emotions. So now an open question would be, well, would Giovanna like bring a certain notion of intentionality into her account? If so, how? Or would she say this talk about emotions being given to us in a certain mode of representation is just nonsense? I don't know. That's an open question I have. And another thing is, how do we account for the emotions having detachable objects? Detachable objects already came up in the last talk. This is a typical criterion for for the need of representations. And if you think of an emotion where you are afraid of a bear in front of you, of course that's a typical example where the object stands right before your eyes. But if you're afraid of an upcoming war, I think that's a fairly detached object, and this is not an untypical example for an emotion. So this would be another open question that I don't think Giovanna addresses in any kind of sense, or if so, I have overlooked that. So there's many open questions. We can look at somebody who's not so neutral with regard to the question of whether there are representations or not. This is then Hatto's approach. Hatto is very explicit in his denial of representations. Here's what he says with regard to emotions. He says, we should let go of the idea that emotions represent situations in truth evaluable ways, and that all appraisals must be representational in this sense. This requires giving up the idea, for example, that in the right conditions my anger represents truly that there has been a demeaning offense against me and mine. We are set up to be set off by core relational themes, by responding to these in distinctive ways that implicate different feelings. And I'll come back to this very last part, but what is eye-catching again is Hatto also adopts this idea of emotions being about core relational themes. But then he has the idea that we do not even need representations of the simplest form to explain how this could be, but rather thinks of distinctive ways in which we respond to core relational themes. So if you look at Hatto's account in more detail, what Hatto claims is emotions are intentional but not intentional or representational. His main point is to say they do not aim at truth or adequacy. He then gives a positive definition in this particular paper on emotions, where he says that emotions should be understood as responses, or as a response that is, first of all, reliably caused by or nomically dependent upon the occurrence of certain external features, then second, disposed to produce certain effects under specific conditions, and then third, selected because of propensities for 1 and 2. So you could think of a response like a fear reaction that is reliably caused by dangerous stimuli in front of you, and thereby disposed to produce certain effects like trembling or increase of heart rate and so on and so forth. And this is selected for this. Hatto also gives a negative definition of what a representation is. That might sound familiar to some of you. And thereby a definition of what an emotion is not. He says, only states that have the proper function to indicate that things are thus and so in a larger cognitive economy are representational. Now, this is a rather demanding definition of a representation, and I think Hatto adopts this to make very clear why it would be totally absurd to think of emotions as representational. But I think even if we take this definition and then look at emotions as a phenomenon, it's not clear at all that this is not a function that emotions do have to state that, to indicate that things are thus and so in a larger cognitive economy. And I'll come back to why I think this is not clear in a minute. So in general, what I want to say is that enactive accounts in this form fail to acknowledge the cognitive complexity and the normative dimension of emotions. Like, I would say emotions can be adequate and inadequate. This is how we talk about emotions all the time. Emotions appear to entertain complex and intelligible relations to each other and to other mental states, and I'll develop that a bit further in a minute. And here's the third point that I have to leave out for today for reasons of time. Emotions are concerned with social and moral values. I briefly mentioned that in the beginning. There's a debate in developmental psychology about at what age, for example, we could ascribe guilt or shame to infants. And a very popular view is to say, well, at the age where they have a conceptual understanding of the fact that they violated a social rule or norm. Now, this is arguable, and I myself would favor another position, but still you somehow have to account for the fact that the intentional object of guilt is quite complex, and that the cognitive abilities you might need to grasp this intentional object in whatever kind of way need to be packed out a little bit. And if you are able to do that without using representations, that's fine, but that's something that would need to be developed. And Hatto does not talk about these emotions at all. He in his paper he says that he only wants to explain basic emotions, and thereby he leaves all emotions like guilt and shame out of the story. Well, that's one solution. There's good reasons to question the distinction between basic emotions and higher cognitive emotions, but that's another issue. Colombetti does not leave these emotions out of the story, so she definitely would need an explanation of what it means to feel guilty or to feel shame if there's no representations involved in the story. Okay, so to sum this up, the need for representations, I think one point is emotions happen to have detachable objects, so we somehow have to account for that. Another point that I will come back to in a second is emotions are not just causal responses to a given stimulus. And this is something that I will have a closer look at the next slide, looking back at Hatto's model, because he seems to suggest that there are causal stimuli that cause emotional responses. Then the intentional objects of emotions are quite complex. This is the point I just explained with regard to emotions such as guilt or shame. We talk about emotions as being adequate or inadequate all the time. We say that it's inappropriate to be afraid in a certain situation or to be jealous in a certain situation. Maybe we don't need to commit ourselves to semantic norms to explain the way we are talking about emotions, but we do have to account for this practice somehow. And a point that I'm going to develop in the following, emotions do play an important role in a larger cognitive economy. So it's not clear that this definition that Hatto gives for representation is an absurd definition with regard to emotions. So now, I said in the previous slide, emotions are not just causal responses to a given stimulus. Now, here's Hatto's model again that I already presented to you. The first point says emotions are reliably caused by or normically dependent upon the occurrence of certain external features. Now, if this would be a characterization of the blinking reflex, I guess I would understand what this is supposed to mean. That would be something like, well, there's objects that quickly approach the eye, and this causal trigger then disposes you to produce certain effects, namely close your eye, and this has a certain function. With regard to emotions, I already have problems to understand the first point. If you say emotions are reliably caused by the occurrence of certain external features, I guess in such an externalist framework you would need to say something about these external features and what unifies them. But we can be afraid of whatsoever, so there's an indefinite group of possible stimuli for being afraid. So I wonder what Hatto would say with regard to that. And then, in trying to find an answer, I looked back at the paper. I already quoted that. He says we are set up to be set off by correlational themes by responding to these in distinctive ways that implicate different feelings. So if we are set off by correlational themes, does this mean that correlational themes can cause emotions? This somehow seems to be the implication of that quote, but that's a funny thing to say, because correlational themes are like the property of being dangerous. And I actually think that this is what Jesse Prince would want to say. Jesse Prince says there are relational properties like being dangerous, being a loss, and so on and so forth in the outside world. Our ancestors already faced them before they were even able to detect them, and then came up with a response that was useful to deal with this part, with the situations. Now the question is, is Hatto saying the same thing? No. He says, Prince holds that correlational themes are wholly objective and mind-independent. They are not to be understood as any kind of response-dependent properties. It is disputable that this is the best way to understand their nature. So he's not denying that emotions are about relational properties, but he's somehow suggesting that there might be an ontologically more better solution for that. And actually, I think for such an account, no. If you really want to tell that kind of story with that model, if you want to say emotions are reliably caused by the occurrence of certain external features, then you need to be consequent and you need to tell a story about properties in the world that are somehow causally efficient and can really or triggers that because they are dangerous can trigger a certain kind of emotions. Otherwise, I just don't understand what Hatto is saying there. So, again, the need for representations, I think, arises from the fact, first of all, that there is no definite group of external stimuli that triggers emotions. You might want to say that the intentional objects, like fear and so on, are properties in a somehow causal relevant sense, but this would need to be developed. And then the other point, the intentional objects of emotions cannot be cashed out in non-intentional terms. So a fear reaction in front of a dog is about the dogs being dangerous, not about its having huge teeth. And you might even want to say that its dangerousness is given to us in a particular way. This is at least what cognitivists would want to say, and why they say that emotions are intentional. And I don't really think, Hatto obviously denies that emotions are intentional, and I think this is simply an inadequate characterization of the phenomenon. It's not that it's so very not clear what emotions are about and how their objects are given to us. I think that is fairly clear. So we do talk about emotions as being adequate or inadequate. I said that before, and the overall conclusion would be to say, well, there is a systematic need for representations with regard to emotions. Now, a further question would be, is this need really there with regard to the particular definition that Hatto gave us? To remind you, Hatto says, only states that have the proper function to indicate that things are thus and so in a larger cognitive economy are representational. Now, one thing that cognitivists have said again and again is that emotions are not merely adequate in the sense that their objects can be present or not. They also, emotions can also be adequate or inadequate in the way they relate to other emotions and other mental states. So here's one example, not mine. If I am afraid that my prize mingweight could break at a cocktail party, I will be happy to find it safe and sound, sad if it is broken, and angry if a friend broke it on purpose. This is an example by Bennett Helm, and Helm has the idea in the background that the way emotions relate to each other somehow makes it reasonable to be sad if you were afraid before, if then what you were afraid of becomes true. And it would be totally unreasonable in the very same situation to be angry. Is that right? No, to be relieved, for example. We would simply not understand why this person is behaving in such a way. And there is a certain need to explain in what way emotions do relate to each other. And what cognitivists would say is, well, they are part of an inferential network of judgments and beliefs that we happen to have, and therefore it's reasonable to have certain emotions in certain situations. So if you don't want to say that, you have to think of some alternative solution, and I don't know any embodied account that does that. So I don't know any embodied theory that is even talking about these phenomena that cognitivists were talking about basically all the time. So another example by Anthony Kenny is to say, if a man says he feels remorse for the actions of someone quite unconnected to him, or is envious of his own vices, we are at a loss to understand him. Now here, I think the distinction is to say it's one thing that emotions can misrepresent. It's one thing that we can be envious in situations where it's not adequate to be envious. That happens all the time. But it's another thing to say, I envy myself. That's simply irrational. We just don't understand what this is supposed to mean. And Kenny's answer, again, would be that this is because, well, we have a concept of what it means to be envy. And because the emotion is informed about our further beliefs that we have, people who kind of are rational overall would not envy themselves. So, because of this framework, I don't know, I think it's not clear at all to say that emotions do not have the function to indicate that things are thus and so in a larger cognitive economy. I mean, one thing that we need to say for sure is that emotions are somehow related in content-sensitive ways. And then it might be arguable how precisely we should do that, but to simply say that if we have this definition of what a representation is, it's clear that emotions are not representations. That's not clear to me at all. Okay. Here's an in-between conclusion, and I guess it already should be more or less the conclusion, because I already used a lot of time. But very generally, we need to account for the emotions being subject to semantic norms and to the way they relate to other emotions and other mental states. But we should not go back to the cognitivist model because it's over-intellectualizing emotions. That also is clear, and we should keep the insights from the embodied approaches that I've mentioned in the beginning. That's also quite clear. Now here's a very coarse-grained suggestion. I would like to think of emotions as action-oriented, embodied representations. I do think that talking about emotions as being somehow constituted by bodily patterns that you can distinguish if you look at different emotion types is a very promising view. I would want to deny that. And I think such an action-oriented view can be combined with Gibson's theory of affordances, but I'm going to leave that aside for now because there's not enough time left for that. I think we could also say about such action-oriented representations that they are subject to semantic norms insofar as they are set up by evolution to represent affordances. And then a very, very, very tentative suggestion would be to say, well, we could think of emotions as being a representational system in themselves where the affordances they are about and the bodily responses with which we respond to emotions stand in a systematic relation to each other. And maybe because this is the most controversial and interesting point, I just look for the slide where I introduce that claim. If you think, for example, about fear as being about an affordance such as a danger to be avoided, and then you think of relief, this is a very funny way of putting the affordance, but anyway, relief as being about the removal of a danger to relax about. What you can see there is that the affordances are somehow related in the way that on the one hand there's a danger present, on the other there's no danger present anymore. And then if you look on the other hand at the bodily reactions that you find, there is kind of a systematic relation between these bodily reactions as well. Like in fear you find an increase of heart rate, in relief you find decrease of heart rate. You find tense muscles in fear and relaxation of the muscles in relief, and so on and so forth. So you could say that the way we should think about emotions being connected is not even a content-sensitive connection. It's rather a way of... Where is that? Anyways, it's rather a way of thinking about affordances being properties in the world that motivate you for action, that stand in relations to each other, that, well, make it reasonable to react in certain kinds of ways in certain situations, but not in others. And that the bodily reactions that respond to that are also related in a systematic way. that's a very tentative suggestion. I don't know if any of you is convinced by that, but it's at least the only one I could think of that would be a radical embodied approach that would try to somehow explain the fact that there are these relations between emotions and other mental states. So, yes, where am I? So the very general conclusion, or rather suggestion, would be that an account that thinks of emotions as embodied action-oriented representations can replace a cognitivist account without forgetting about the complexity that emotions obviously have. Thank you.